The shriek of the wind clawing at the skeletal frame of Ella's city was deafening. Elijah gripped the control panel, his knuckles white, sweat beading on his brow. The city, a marvel of anti-gravity engineering, swayed precariously, a fragile nest in the heart of a tempest. He wrestled with the experimental weather manipulation system, trying to coax the raging wind currents into submission. Each flicker of light on the control panel mirrored the lightning flashing outside, illuminating the exhaustion etched onto his face. 5 years. 5 years since a similar storm had ripped his family from his arms, leaving him with only the echoing roar of the wind as a constant, agonizing reminder. Today, he wouldn't let that happen again. He focused, pouring every ounce of his grief, his fury, his hope, into the complex equation scrolling across the screens. Slowly, agonizingly, the wind began to relent, the city's swaying subsided, and the howling diminished to a mournful whisper. He slumped back in his chair, the adrenaline fading, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. Through the observation window, he saw her. A figure, silhouetted against the bruised sky, wings outstretched, navigating the turbulent air currents with an effortless grace. She landed on a nearby platform, her iridescent blue feathers ruffled by the dying wind. He'd seen Zephyrians before, of course, but something about her, the fierce determination in her golden eyes, the way she cradled a wounded bird in her taloned hand, held him captive. He watched as she tended to other Zephyrians, their hollow bones vulnerable to the brutal force of the storms. Their world, this world they shared, was a beautiful, terrifying paradox. Later, cleaning a minor cut sustained during the storm's fury, he thought of her again. He'd seen empathy in her eyes, a reflection of his own aching desire to protect life on Zephyr, both human and Zephyrian. That empathy, the shared vulnerability in the face of the storm, was a fragile bridge between their worlds. He had to know more about her people. He had to find a way to build a stronger bridge, a lasting peace. His work on harnessing Zephyr's winds for energy was more than just scientific pursuit, it was a desperate plea for harmony, a chance to finally quell the storm raging within him. The air in the conference hall crackled with static, both meteorological and social. Elijah nervously adjusted his collar, the weight of his presentation settling heavily on his shoulders. He could see her across the room, Kira, her iridescent blue feathers a splash of vibrant color amidst the muted tones of the human scientists. Their eyes met briefly, hers holding a mixture of curiosity and guardedness. He quickly looked away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to focus. The future of Zephyr, the possibility of coexistence, rested, in part, on his research. His presentation on harnessing Zephyr's wind energy was met with polite interest from the human contingent, but the Zephyrians remained skeptical. Kira, however, listened intently, her golden eyes fixed on him. When it was her turn, she spoke of the delicate symbiotic relationship between the Zephyrians and the unique flora of Zephyr, her voice a melodic counterpoint to the wind whistling outside. She described how the plants provided medicine, building materials, and even a form of energy, a connection so deep it bordered on spiritual. Elijah was captivated, seeing a reflection of his own deep connection to Zephyr's atmosphere, a shared understanding of the planet's power and fragility. During the break, he approached her, a nervous flutter in his stomach. "Your research is fascinating," he began, the words feeling inadequate. "The way your people live in harmony with Zephyr, it's something humanity could learn from." A flicker of something, was it amusement? Crossed her face. "Learn, perhaps," she said, her voice low and musical. "But will you change?" Her words hung in the air, a question that resonated with the unspoken tension simmering beneath the surface of the conference. The presentation by a Zephyr Industries executive that followed underscored her point. He outlined the corporation's plans to expand their mining operations, a blatant disregard for the Zephyrian sacred groves and the fragile ecosystem they sustained. Elijah felt a wave of shame, a stark awareness of the chasm that separated his people from hers. Later, at the conference reception, Elijah found himself drawn to a secluded balcony overlooking the swirling cloudscape. Kira joined him, the silence broken only by the wind. "They don't understand," she murmured, her voice laced with sadness. "They see only what they can take, not what they destroy." He reached out, his hand hovering just above her feathered arm, hesitant to touch. Not all of us, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The contact, when it finally came, was electric. Her feathers were softer than he expected, warm beneath his fingertips. He retracted his hand quickly, his cheeks burning. "You are different, Elijah," she said, her gaze intense. "But can you convince your people?" Her words echoed his own internal struggle. He believed in the potential for harmony, but the greed of Zephyr Industries cast a long shadow. He knew then that his work was about more than just scientific advancement, it was about proving to Kira, to her people, that humanity wasn't just a destructive force. That night, under the cover of darkness, Kira slipped into Elijah's quarters. She handed him a data chip containing evidence of Zephyr Industries' illegal activities, a risky move that could expose her involvement in the resistance. "I trust you, Elijah," she whispered, her golden eyes searching his. "Prove me right." The weight of the chip felt heavy in his hand, a symbol of her faith in him, in the possibility of something more. He knew then that he couldn't return to Earth, not while Zephyr and Kira needed him. He was choosing a side, a future, and it was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The shimmering waterfalls cascading from the floating islands of Zephyr mesmerized Elijah. Kira, perched on a wind-carved rock, her blue feathers catching the sunlight, looked like a creature born of the very air itself. They had been exploring Zephyr's hidden grottos for days, sharing stories, laughter echoing against the windswept cliffs. He was falling for her, falling hard and fast, like a skydiver caught in a downdraft. "This is the Whisperwood," Kira said, her voice hushed with reverence. She gestured towards a grove of bioluminescent plants, their gentle glow illuminating the cavern. "Our ancestors believed that the spirits of Zephyr resided here." He reached out, his fingers brushing against a luminous leaf. It felt strangely warm, pulsing with a faint energy. "It's beautiful," he breathed, his gaze meeting hers. She smiled, a rare and precious sight. "Zephyr provides for all our needs," she said softly. "Medicine, shelter, energy, everything." Her smile faded, replaced by a shadow of pain. Everything except protection from those who would exploit her. He knew she was talking about Zephyr Industries. He thought of the data chip she had given him, the evidence of their reckless disregard for the planet's ecosystem. The weight of it pressed against his chest, a constant reminder of the chasm between his people and hers. He told her about his family, about the storm that had taken them, about the emptiness that had haunted him ever since. "I came here to build something better," he confessed, his voice raw with emotion. "To create a future where such tragedies never happen again." Kira listened intently, her golden eyes filled with a depth of understanding that surprised him. When he finished, she reached out, her taloned hand gently touching his cheek. The contact sent a shiver down his spine, a strange mixture of fear and longing. He had never touched a Zephyrian so intimately before, never felt the delicate texture of her feathers beneath his fingertips. "I believe you, Elijah," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "But your people, can they change?" Her question pierced him, a painful reminder of the conflict brewing between their worlds. He wanted to reassure her, to promise her a future free of conflict, but the truth was, he didn't know. That night, a message arrived from Earth, the recall order. His research was deemed too risky, too close to the volatile politics of Zephyr. They offered him a prestigious position back on Earth, a chance to rebuild his life, to finally leave the ghosts of Zephyr behind. He looked at the message, then at the sleeping form of Kira nestled beside him, her blue feathers shimmering in the moonlight. The choice tore at him, a battle between his past and his future. He deleted the message. He couldn't leave, not now. Zephyr, Kira, needed him. He had found a new family here, a new purpose, a new beginning. The next morning, a coded message reached Kira. Zephyr Industries was planning to destroy the Whisperwood, to mine the rare minerals that pulsed beneath its luminous flora. Kira's face paled. The Whisperwood was sacred to her people, the heart of their spiritual connection to Zephyr. She had to warn them. "I'm going," she said, her voice strained. "I have to stop them." Elijah knew the risks. Zephyr Industries wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. Let me come with you, he pleaded. She shook her head. It's too dangerous. They will kill you. Then I'll help you from here, he insisted, his mind racing. He could use his weather manipulation technology to create a diversion, to buy her time. Kira hesitated, her golden eyes searching his. Finally, she nodded. She kissed him then, a fleeting touch of her beak against his lips, a gesture of trust and farewell. He watched her soar into the wind, a blue streak against the vast canvas of the sky, his heart heavy with foreboding. He had chosen a side, and now, he had to fight. He activated his system, directing a localized storm towards the mining site, a desperate gamble to protect the woman he loved and the world she cherished. He knew that this act of defiance would brand him a traitor in the eyes of many humans, but he couldn't stand idly by while Zephyr Industries desecrated the planet, while they threatened Kira's life. He watched the storm gather strength, a swirling vortex of wind and lightning, a symbol of his commitment, his hope, his love for Kira. The future was uncertain, fraught with danger, but in that moment, as the storm raged, he felt a strange sense of peace. He was finally fighting for something he believed in, something worth fighting for. The coded message Kira received pulsed in Elijah's mind like a second heartbeat. The Whisperwood, the sacred grove, was Zephyr Industries' next target. Kira, her face a mask of controlled fury, prepared to leave. He knew he couldn't stop her, not this time. The Whisperwood was too important, a symbol of her people's connection to Zephyr, a connection he was beginning to understand, to cherish. There has to be another way, he pleaded, his voice tight with anxiety. Let me try to reason with them. Kira's laugh was bitter. Reason? They understand only profit, Elijah. They will not listen. But he had to try. He contacted Zephyr Industries, requesting a meeting, using his reputation as a respected engineer to gain access. He argued, he pleaded, he presented his research on sustainable energy, a solution that could benefit both humans and Zephyrians. They listened, or pretended to, their expressions veiled, their words carefully chosen. He felt a growing unease, a sense of something lurking beneath the surface of their polite disinterest. Then, it happened. Explosions rocked the platform, the lights flickered, and chaos erupted. Zephyr Industries hadn't come to negotiate, they'd come to silence him, to crush any opposition to their plans. They'd underestimated Kira. She burst into the room, a whirlwind of blue feathers and righteous fury, flanked by other members of the resistance. The ensuing battle was a blur of flashing lights, the shriek of alarms, and the acrid smell of smoke. Elijah, caught in the crossfire, found himself fighting alongside Kira, protecting her, defending the principles they both believed in. He used his knowledge of the station systems to their advantage, rerouting power, sealing off sections, creating diversions. He saw one of the Zephyr Industries security officers raise a weapon, aiming directly at Kira. Without thinking, he pushed her aside, taking the blast himself. He crumpled to the floor, a searing pain radiating through his shoulder. He dimly registered Kira's cry of anguish, the frantic flapping of her wings as she knelt beside him. He'd known, deep down, that this might happen. He'd accepted the risk. He'd chosen her, chosen Zephyr, over his own safety, over his own people. Elijah! Kira's voice was thick with despair. She pressed a hand to his wound, her touch surprisingly gentle despite her talons. He winced, but the pain was overshadowed by the warmth of her hand, the fear in her eyes. I'm all right, he whispered, though he wasn't sure if it was true. He looked into her eyes, her golden gaze filled with a depth of emotion he couldn't decipher. In that moment, surrounded by chaos and violence, he felt a profound connection to her, a sense of shared purpose, a bond forged in fire and blood. He knew then, with absolute certainty, that he loved her. The resistance, bolstered by Kira's ferocity and Elijah's unexpected intervention, managed to repel Zephyr Industries' forces. The victory was bittersweet, purchased with blood and sacrifice. As the smoke cleared, Kira cradled Elijah in her arms, her tears mixing with the blood staining his shirt. She whispered words in her native tongue, words he didn't understand, but the raw emotion in her voice transcended language. He touched her face, his fingers tracing the delicate curve of her beak, the smooth texture of her feathers. He'd never been so close to her before, never felt so vulnerable, so exposed, so utterly connected. Later, in the relative safety of a hidden Zephyrian sanctuary, Kira tended to his wound. Her touch, once hesitant, was now confident, almost possessive. He watched her, the flickering light casting shadows on her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her features, the fierce beauty that had captivated him from the moment he saw her. He knew that this was just the beginning, that the conflict was far from over. They had won a battle, but the war for Zephyr's future was still raging. And he, the human outsider, had chosen his side. He was no longer just an atmospheric engineer, he was a protector, a fighter, a lover, bound to Kira and to Zephyr by a love as fierce and untamed as the winds themselves. The acrid smell of smoke still clung to the air, a phantom limb of the recent battle. Elijah lay on a makeshift bed in the heart of the Whisperwood, the soft glow of the bioluminescent plants casting an ethereal light on Kira's face as she tended his wound. Her touch, light as a zephyr's breath, sent shivers down his spine, a strange mix of pain and pleasure. He'd never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. His life, once a carefully constructed equation of logic and scientific pursuit, had been thrown into chaos by the storm that was Kira. And yet, in this chaos, he felt a strange sense of peace. He'd found something he'd been searching for, something he hadn't even realized he was missing. A connection. A belonging. A love that defied logic and transcended the boundaries of species. "You shouldn't have done that," Kira murmured, her voice laced with worry. "You could have been killed." He reached up, his hand trembling, and gently touched her cheek. Her skin, smooth and cool beneath his fingertips, felt alien and familiar all at once. "I couldn't let them hurt you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Her golden eyes, usually so fierce, were filled with a vulnerability that mirrored his own. "And now what, Elijah?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind through the luminous leaves. "Where do we go from here?" He didn't have an answer. His carefully laid plans, his dreams of a harmonious future, felt naive now, shattered by the reality of the conflict, by the depth of the hatred between humans and Zephyrians. He'd chosen a side, but at what cost? He thought of the recall message, the chance to return to Earth, to leave the ghosts of his past behind. That life felt like a distant dream now, a world he no longer belonged to. He'd found a new home, a new purpose, here on Zephyr, with Kira. "We build," he said, his voice gaining strength. "We build a future together." A flicker of hope ignited in her eyes, a fragile flame in the darkness. The following days were a blur of negotiations and tense standoffs. The attack had forced both sides to the table, but the air was thick with mistrust. Elijah, his arm still bandaged, worked tirelessly, using his research to demonstrate the viability of his sustainable energy solution. He spoke of a shared future, a Zephyr where both humans and Zephyrians could thrive. He could feel Kira's presence beside him, a silent source of strength, her belief in him bolstering his resolve. One evening, amidst the ongoing negotiations, a coded message reached Kira. Her face paled. "They're planning another attack," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They intend to destroy the main energy conduit, blame the resistance, and justify a full-scale assault." Elijah's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about resources anymore, it was about annihilation. He looked at Kira, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. He knew what he had to do. "I'll go," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "I'll warn them. I'll try to stop them." Kira gripped his arm, her talons digging into his skin. "No," she pleaded. "It's a trap. They'll kill you." He gently pried her hand loose, his heart aching at the fear in her eyes. "Someone has to try," he said. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently caressing her cheeks. "I have to do this, Kira. For us. For Zephyr." He left before she could argue, racing towards the human sector, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He knew he was walking into a lion's den, but he had to try. He had to prove to Kira, to himself, that humanity wasn't beyond redemption. He reached the conduit just as the Zephyr Industry security forces arrived. He tried to reason with them, to explain the devastating consequences of their actions. They laughed, their faces contorted with a mixture of contempt and amusement. He knew then that he'd been a fool. Explosions rocked the platform, the lights flickered, and the world plunged into darkness. He felt a searing pain in his leg, and then, nothing. He awoke to the gentle glow of the whisperwood, Kira's anxious face hovering above him. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry rasp. "You saved them," Kira whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You disabled the detonators. You saved the station." He smiled weakly. He'd done it. He'd chosen Zephyr, chosen Kira, over his own people. And in doing so, he'd found his true home. The aftermath of the averted catastrophe brought a fragile peace. Elijah's sustainable energy solution was finally implemented, a testament to his vision, his unwavering belief in a shared future. But their victory came at a price. He was ostracized by many humans, branded a traitor for siding with the Zephyrians. Kira, too, faced criticism from her own people, her relationship with a human viewed with suspicion and distrust. They stood hand in talon, outcasts in their own worlds, their love a fragile beacon in the storm. The future was uncertain, fraught with challenges. But as they looked out at the swirling cloudscape, at the windswept beauty of Zephyr, they knew they weren't alone. They had each other. And in that connection, they found the strength to face whatever the future held, their love a whisper of hope in the wind.